let's get started. And thank you so much for everybody for coming precisely on time. So on behalf of World Disability Matters and the Rotary Disability Advocacy Group, I am delighted to welcome everybody who's attending this amazing webinar. Thank you. The numbers are picking up beautifully. And for joining us in the first, I think, of more, then we'll definitely have more, the first of many, I suspect. And we're going to be discussing advocacy. So what I'll do first is I will go around the room, randomly picking one of our panelists, and then they will introduce themselves with 1 minute. Note, 1 minute, quickly, just a quick introduction, just so that you'll know who we have. I'll begin by with introducing myself. And so my name is Jeremy Opperman. I live in Cape Town, South Africa. I belong to the Rotary Club of Newlands, which is in District 9350. Now, I must stress that this webinar is not strictly a Rotary affair. It just happens to be that Ken Masson, who is our indestructible producer, has managed to, as an old Rotarian, has managed to begin this entire initiative a couple of years ago. And so all thanks go to Ken for this and for his district for starting this process. So, like I said, not everybody in the room is going to be a Rotarian. But Rotary is something that many of us in this room, many of us on this panel know something about. And I'm a Rotarian, as I said. So we are interested in exploring the connection between disability, inclusion, and the entire Rotary narrative. So my name is Jeremy Opperman, I said, and I am blind. So forgive me if I get off frame, because I have absolutely no idea whether I am in. Ken said I was, so I'm trusting that I am. And I'm a disability, or actually I'm a DEI consultant, advocate / activist. I have done this now for 23 years in South Africa. And I'm very, and I'm also part of the Rotary International DEI task force, and I'm waving the disability flag on that task force. And so I'm very grateful for RI for opening up the DEI conversation within Rotary, in the Rotary context. And so that's me. And so I'm going to be moderating today, and I have some guests. We've got to know many of our guests very, very well. And they come from a wonderfully diverse range of countries. We have Brazil, America, India, Egypt, and Kenya represented here today. And so I'll begin with my friend Luis Maud from Brazil. Luis, would you like to have a 1 minute introduction, please?
Hello, Jeremy. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for the and my name is Luis Mausch. I came from Brazil. I'm a white guy with almost bald hair, and I use a barb, and I'm dressed in like a blue sweater. Behind me, there's something that looks like an old window. I am one of the co-founders of Mais Diferenças, More Differences in English. It's a no-profit organization, and we run projects in the educational and cultural fields here in Brazil, and we also have some projects in Africa and Central America. And I am also like a social entrepreneur. I run another company. It's based in technology company, assistive technology, working a lot with assistive technology and communication, accessibility, and also part of the Rotary Club from Disability. And I'm also in consultancy for ITU, is International Telecommunication Union, and also FAO is Food and Agricultural Organization in the fields of accessibility and inclusion as well. So it's my pleasure to be here and be the first to introduce myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And before I introduce you to another person, I've noticed there's a couple of people who haven't muted themselves. Please, can I ask that you mute yourself? Let's begin. Well, let's take our second person, Jacqueline Wilson from Egypt. Jacqueline, would you like to give us a 1-minute introduction?
Hi, Jeremy. I'm delighted to be with you today. My name is Jacqueline Wilson. I am a physician in Alexandria. I work here as a deputy manager in a private hospital. I am a proud Rotarian. Last year, I served as a president of Rotary Club of Alexandria Pharos. And this year, I founded the first e-club in our district, 2451. This is the first e-club here. This is called the EG International. I'm delighted to be with you. Thanks for kind invitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. Thank you very much. That was quick and sharp. I know you've got lots more to say later. Nilesh Singh from Mumbai, India. Nilesh? Nilesh, are you still with us?
He's having some microphone problems. I'm not sure why.
Oh, shame. Okay, I tell you what. I'll take the pressure off, Nilesh. Let me get somebody else just to take the pressure off. You get your microphone working. How about Jackie Jeru from Kenya? Jackie, give us a 1-minute introduction. Jackie from Kenya.
And she's muted. Jackie, there you go.
Sorry, Jeremy. Greetings, everyone. In Kenya, it's 5 p.m. in the evening. So my name is Jackie Njero. I'm sorry, I'm a bit under the weather, so you'll excuse me. My name is Rotarian Jackie Njero. Actually, the current presidential elect in 2022, 2023, meaning I'll be the president of Rotary Club of Milimani from 2022 to 2023, from 2023 next year. My full-time job is a financial advisor. I offer investment solutions and risk management services through insurance as well. And I also advocate for persons with disabilities, especially those who are deaf. And I'm actually very passionate about it. That's why I want to be a guest in this panel, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. And I think what you omitted to say was that you have a deaf son, which of course is the reason why you're as passionate as you are. Thank you very much, Jackie. Ken, I believe we're still missing. I heard Nilesh fall off, unless he's back on. I didn't hear him come on. Nilesh, are you with us?
He's here.
Okay, moving straight.
Here. Jeremy's here. Nilesh?
No, Jeremy's here. Looking for Nilesh.
No, Nilesh is here.
Is he? Nilesh, are you open to speak now? Is your mic fixed?
He's on mute.
Okay.
Nilesh, you're on mute. There you go. You want to try it? Nilesh?
Okay, I'll drive. All right.
Okay, sorry.
Shame, Nilesh. I'm sorry. You were coming through loud and clear earlier. All right. While you get, nope, he's left the meeting again. That's a great shame, but I'm sure he'll be back on. And last but not least, until Nilesh comes on, that is my name brother, Jeremy Warrener, all the way from Indianapolis. Jeremy, introduce yourself.
Thank you, and good morning. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm Jeremy Warner from Indianapolis, Indiana, in the United States. And my background is in hotel and restaurant management until about 16 years ago, when I was involved in a bad car accident that led to me becoming a burn survivor and a bilateral above knee amputee. After returning to work, I realized how important it was for us to use our voices to to make the changes and advocate for the things that we needed. So that led to me leaving the hospitality industry and developing my own organization, Walking Spirit, which is a diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting and support organization from a disability lens. So very focused on that aspect of DEI, as the more accessible we can make the world, the more diverse, the more inclusive, and the more equitable it can become. So thank you for joining us here today. Is Nilesh back on yet?
I heard him come on. I don't know if he can speak. Nilesh, are you unmuted? Can you speak?
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, yes. Well done. You're in. I heard you.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Finally. Sorry for the just change
That's
my
fine.
computer. So just change my computer. So I'm just learning ropes. I'm Nilesh Singhit from Bombay. I'm a person with disability, cerebral palsy, quadriplegia. I have been associated with many organizations. Over the years, I am founder member of Adapt Right Group and also founder member of Disability and Design Foundation. Last nearly for 2 decades, I've been working on disability rights with special emphasis on accessibility and the law. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you. And you came in just in the nick of time. Right. So now let's kick off. As I said, I beg your pardon. Every now and again, I'm going to need to cough. I do beg your pardon. So we're talking today about advocacy. And it sounds like a simple enough term, advocacy. It sounds like, a completely self-explanatory. And yet, what is advocacy? And what we're going to be talking about today is there enough advocacy? What exactly is advocacy? Each one of us are coming from a different country. 3 of us happen to come from the continent of Africa, it's true, but everybody's got a different perspective of advocacy. And it's very telling. And so first thing we're going to do is I'm going to go around, I think in the same order, that might create some stability here, and ask our panelists their interpretation of advocacy, just your ideas. There are no right or wrong answers, I believe, in this particular area, but one's experience colors the opinions that you have. And so we can all learn from them. And so, Luis, your opinion on advocacy, and we're looking at about 2 or 3 minutes here. Your opinions on advocacy.
Okay, Jeremy. For me, advocacy, it's like when we support different kind of groups in the fight of their rights, because in the end, what we need to do is to give some attention for different kind of groups, sometimes minorized groups, and help them and support them to reach their basic rights. Yeah, we can work that in legislation, we can work that in our society, in day by day. And that's what is advocacy for me, and what we can, in my case, I don't have any kind of disability, but I am a professional. I dedicate my whole professional life in this field. And for me, it's this like what we can do for the others, but not the others, but in the end for ourselves, for the whole society, because we are in, and especially when we're working with inclusion and accessibility, it's a win-win advocacy, in the end. That's what it is for me.
Thank you. Thank you. From time to time, the privilege of the moderator is that I will be able to ask you questions, but I won't do that right now. But don't be surprised if I flesh out some of the things that you've said. I'm trying to think of the order. Okay, Jacqueline Wilson, what is your thoughts on equity? What do you think advocacy is?
Yeah, Jeremy, in my concept, advocacy is a non-stop journey. It means to support, promote, and improve the issues of disability for individuals and for communities in my country, here in Egypt, and all over the world. I think it needs a lot of integration and collaboration of different parties. I think that we can work on a global level like this webinar by exchanging of information or studying the success story in each country. And can work also on a country level in each country, like in Egypt here, we can work on a national level to improve their legislation, to do health awareness. And for me as a physician, to prevent, treat, and rehabilitate the disabled persons. Also, we can work on a level of the communities for the caregivers. And lastly, for the individuals, we can get rid of the stigma. We can work to treat the patients and to help them, to give them the assistive devices. And we can do a lot of efforts are needed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we will unpack these concepts just now, later. I just wanted to lay some grounding. Jackie and Jeru from Kenya, what is your interpretation of advocacy?
Thank you, Jeremy. To me, advocacy, I use two approaches. One, to the person, to the individuals themselves who are living with disabilities. Like you didn't mention that I have a son who is deaf, actually. He's now 11 years. So we intervened for him, and right now, he did a cochlear implant, he hears, and he speaks. We do a lot of speech therapy. So he's slowly overcoming the disability. So I keep on talking to persons living with disabilities and let them know that it's okay to be different from others. And you can actually make it in life. You can actually achieve your purposes regardless of being different. I also like reaching out to the society to break the bias and the stigma that comes with disability, because I realize especially in Africa, disability has not really been embraced. So we still have a long way to go. So we keep on fighting for the diversity, inclusion, and equity for persons living with disabilities.
Right.
Thank you.
Perfect, perfect. Because you're opening the door there for our next question, but I haven't got there yet. I need to go to my friend Jeremy Warrener. Jeremy, your feelings about advocacy? And
So advocacy is many things, but most importantly, it is speaking up for the needs of both yourself and others, recognizing that when you are speaking up for your needs as a person with a disability, you are speaking up for the disability community, and anyone else who experiences similar conditions, even across vast different disabilities. So you're not just working at a self level, you're working at a systems level, doing that in a way that you're constantly educating. And that's not just, trying to educate your lawmakers, but also trying to educate your friends and family around you, as they are also affected by the type of disability that you deal with, and they may be affected by their own. So that to me is what advocacy is about.
Good. We'll touch on the challenges just now. I just want to close the loop with Nilesh. Nilesh Singh from Mumbai. What is advocacy to you, really?
We live in a world, that is specifically for non-disabled people. Disabled people are a minority. So advocacy, for me means to, be that voice, say that, hey boss, I exist. These are my needs. And this is how you need to look at it. Create empathy, demystify what disability is all about. And, and that is the starting point. And once we do that, then kind of, gather a base of like-minded people who would want to kind of support disability. And when there are a lot of barriers that people with disability face, so come up with solutions. I mean, the onus always lies on the person with disability to come up with the solution. I mean, I am not an architect, I am not a lawyer, but I know what it means. I know exactly where the shoe pinches. Once we get the like-minded person like an architect or a lawmaker, then we kind of sensitize them, or even tell them what all disability is all about. Then they can use their expertise, their core knowledge to kind of assist disability. I mean, architects come up with designs that are universally designed. I mean, that are more disabled friendly, and so on and so forth. It begins from self, then it moves to the gradual process of being political and influencing the lawmakers. That is the journey that advocacy means. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nilesh. Now you've opened this up beautifully. So I'm not going to go too formally now. Now I'm interested in those, and I'll just say that it's a little bit undisciplined. So I will pick one of you, not necessarily in order anymore, but we're going to talk about challenges now. So because what you've all said, and I completely endorse what you say, one being a person with a disability, and two having done this for nearly 25 years, is what are the challenges? And if it sounds completely self-explanatory. It sounds rather simple. There doesn't seem to be any logical reason why we shouldn't all be very active advocates. What are the challenges? What are the challenges that we find? Luis, what do you think are the really significant challenges towards people who want to be advocates, or people who try and be advocates?
Thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, we had a lot of challenges, and if we look just for the challenges, sometimes we can be afraid, of face them, because they are a lot. I think one great things and challenges, you need to be a tendency, you need to be focused and really understand and know what you want to do, because it is a process, and it's like someone of our just said, it's like an endless process. Because when I change these, right now I need to change the another part, and right now I need to change another and another and another, and so far. So I think that one great challenge or big challenge is you need to be paying attention what it is happening for the lawmakers and what is happening in the society, what we are doing, what we need to thrive, because in the end, the lawmakers, they are paying attention to what the society wants to, and we need to put our effort, put everybody working together to reach some of these rights, and this is not easy, because we need to negotiate, we need to articulate, and we need to put a lot of attention and also tension to understand what we need, and really know the time that you need to go further and forward, and that's what it is. It's like a balance, Probably when we reach this balance, that we have a good legislation that could bring everybody together. Otherwise, we're just gonna be fighting about other stuff. So I think that is one of the biggest challenges, especially, Jeremy, here in Brazil. We are facing that because we have a good legislation. And right now we need to really pay attention that they cannot take rights for those that are just starting to thrive for their rights, And that's what we are really facing right now in our country.
And now that's really interesting. And for our listeners who aren't particularly overly knowledgeable about this area, is that what you'll notice is that not all countries are the same. And Luis just mentioned that Brazil has good legislation. Now, in my country, South Africa, we absolutely don't, from a disability point of view. We've got a very limiting legislation package, which is, in my opinion, and I might as well throw myself in here like one of the panelists, because from my point of view, and by no means the only challenge, but one of our greatest challenges is the lack of an overarching legislation. And I'm going to throw it to my friend Jeremy Warner. I mean, the Americans with Disabilities Act is 31 years old. How well do you think that's actually facing up to the challenge?
So the Americans with Disabilities Act, I first of all think about that just from a cultural perspective in the United States. people with disabilities were left out of the Civil Rights Act that took place in the 60s. It took another 30 years to get people with disabilities a piece of legislation that protected civil rights, not only at a federal level, but also in a civil rights for people with disabilities at the commercial level. It was Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act that opened up the public sector for people to be able to go out and enjoy life with their family. People with disabilities will tell you that is the biggest impact that the ADA has had. But in recent years, we've also seen legislation get passed that makes it harder for a person with a disability to file a complaint. There's an entire process where the person with the disability has a responsibility to educate the organization to make those attempts before they file any kind of complaint. I don't know of any other civil rights legislation that requires the person being discriminated against to educate. So yeah, its implementation itself is also a challenge.
That's actually very interesting what you just said, because you don't know of anybody of any piece of legislation where you're required to educate. You know, there's a saying in law that ignorance is not a plea in the law, and yet, certainly from my point of view, with the limited legislation opportunities that we have, which are extremely limited, they're more along the lines of an Equality Act, which is an Equality Act, but it's not explicit to disability. And so you can use it, but it's not a piece of disability legislation. And so there's a great deal of education needed constantly to remind people or inform people about their rights. Nilesh, in India, I mean, it's a large country, incredibly populous country, and very diverse in terms of the provinces or the actual states within India. Is it a ubiquitous situation in India? In other words, are they all the same? Is it homogenous, I should have said? Is it homogenous in India about disability rights, or does it depend on the state?
It does depend on the state, because people with disabilities in India do not have a voice. I mean, last few years, things have changed drastically. Everything is decided for people with disabilities. I mean, the entire process. I mean, now, for example, there is this national policy on disability that the draft is being circulated. The government has prepared a draft, and they've given people with disabilities just 1 week to kind of react to it. And the draft, I mean, it reads well, but then there are a lot of lacunae in it. So people with disabilities do not have the time to react. So that is one thing that keeps happening here all the time. Another thing that is there is we do have laws, implementation do not happen. There is not enough, understanding of what the law says. I mean, if you go at the bottom level of the government, they don't even know if it exists. So there's a lot of, such problems that people with disabilities face here in India. Thank you.
Interesting. And now you've touched on something, which of course is that there is in fact a global disability international law in the sense of the convention, depending of course whether the country has signed it and ratified it. But we do have the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Nilesh, you probably know more about that than anybody in this panel. And you were even a participant at one point in New York at its earlier stages. Do you think that it alone can achieve anything close to getting persons with disabilities more inclusion on the world stage and in their own countries?
Yes, I think UNCRPD, I look at it as more as a philosophy that, can be applied to disability in every aspect. I mean, there are two parts to it. India has an act that is pretty close to the UNCRPD. But then there are two things, that there is a letter of the law, and then there is the spirit of the law. So, I mean, if we kind of advocate about the spirit of the law, I think the letter of the law should take care of itself at some point. So that is what, I mean, I've been trying to, that is what my work revolves around. And we've got some good, results. I can give you an example. A few years ago, we had this judicial colloquium. Your friend, maybe you may be knowing him, Justice Yakub of South Africa.
Yes, very well.
Yeah, please, if you meet him, please give him my regards. He had come here to India and we had kind of, a meeting with all the High Court and Supreme Court judges. UNCRPD was discussed in detail and, all that about disability rights. We found after that colloquium, many orders that the various courts passed actually were very close. What people with disability would have wanted. So, that kind of, interaction has its own, benefits. So we've been kind of, reaping benefits on that at quite a lot of levels. Thank you. I hope that answered your question.
No, it was. It was very good. By the way, the person he was referring to was our blind. He's no longer a judge. He's a retired judge, constitutional court judge, Zak Yakub, who is blind, and really was a wonderful poster man for advocacy. And I'm so pleased you brought him up, because you can't get a greater pinnacle of achievement than being a judge who is appointed on merit and our highest court of our land is called our constitutional court. And so he is competent beyond belief. And so you would think that people would look and say, wow, there we go. And yet we still have a situation where I'm the only blind Rotarian, for instance, in my entire district and in the district just north of us, just as to give you an example. And so many people still believe that blind people can't do this or can't do that. So what's fascinating for me is even when you get spectacular advocacy just by being alive, like people like Justice Zak Yakub, isn't necessarily enough. So let's go back to the law. Jacqueline Wilson in Egypt, how do you find the law? Can you in a brief way spell out the law in Egypt around disability and how compliant are people towards it?
Yeah. Before talking about the law, I want to talk about the extent of the issue of disability in Egypt, because this is outstanding. I think that Egypt, as a developing country, we have a very high ratio of disability here. According to WHO and UNDP census in 2016, we found that 13% of Egyptian population are disabled. So it's a very high ratio. If we consider that the impact of the problem extends to 3 or 4 persons of the family, so we will find that 1/3 of the community affected by disability. So we need to change the legislation, because the legislation is the cornerstone of the rights of those people in Egypt. Regarding the legislation in Egypt, you will find that we started since about 30 years. The first legislation regarding the employment, it makes just 5% employment quota for every disabled persons. But the level of illiteracy here is very high among the disabled persons. You will imagine that 40% of the disabled persons cannot catch employment, and more than 80% cannot of females or of women cannot catch employment. This is because this legislation cannot offer a good opportunity for disabled persons. So the problem here is not the legislation only, but the effectiveness and the applicability of the legislation. President Sisi tried to do a new law since 5 years to facilitate the life of disabled persons. It improves the rights of the persons regarding the taxes. They make free taxes of devices, of all assistive technology and devices. This is only, but this legislation couldn't succeed to include the persons of disability to the whole community. In education, no. In acceptance of the community, to eradicate the stigma, no. This is the situation here regarding the legislation. Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much. Jackie Jera from Kenya, what is your view on legislation? How effective is it? Does it do enough? Can it manage? Does it exist in Kenya?
Yes, Jeremy. Legislation indeed exists in Kenya, though not every person with the disabilities is registered, especially the marginalized areas. But the National Council of Persons Living with Disability in Kenya normally do registration drives in the different counties to try and get more persons living with disabilities registered. And they also assist. They give assistive devices to the different persons, to the different disabilities. They pay for some education to some extent, as well as other needs as they arise. So I still feel that much more needs to be done by the government.
Now that's interesting. So from what you're saying is that there are programs where persons with disabilities can in fact apply for, let's say, assistive devices. What sort of assistive devices are we talking about?
I'll talk about like for deaf persons.
Sure.
They can actually apply for a hearing aid. It's only up to a limit, like Kenya shillings 100,000 once per year. So that is the much they can give. If it's school fees, they give something like 33,000 Kenya shillings per year as well. It's still very little, but it goes a long way, especially for the very needy. They really focus on the needy, poverty-stricken, disabled persons, because clearly we will have to keep on looking for funding for these kind of disabilities. There are so many, they are so rampant, and they're actually not able to meet the needs.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. And so, as you can see, that's a wonderful tapestry of examples there of how different disability is dealt with in different countries. And I think it's very important that we bear in mind this extraordinary diversity that we experience. You know, I always make a joke when I talk to Rotary clubs or friends in Canada or Australia, and I was thinking of Canada, and the other day I was doing a talk at a Rotary club, and there was somebody there who knew a lot about disability, and they were talking about, you know, they have somewhere between 40 and 50% employment for persons with disabilities. And I burst out laughing, because in my country, we haven't yet reached 2% employment of persons with disabilities. I noticed, Jackie, you mentioned 5% is the target that government has put in terms of employment. Ours is 2%. And so it's an extraordinary thing that we lack some sort of homogeneity, even though we have the United Nations Convention, which is extremely clear. And if we all followed it and paid attention, I suspect we would achieve a great deal. Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of culture across nations, which is very sad. I realize that in many countries there are bigger fish to fry sometimes. So just for a quick history lesson, South Africa came out of a disastrous several hundred years of racial discrimination. And in 1994, we became a democracy. So that's a very young democracy. We're literally one of the world's youngest democracies. And unfortunately, there were a great many things to get right, particularly from a racial point of view. which is obvious. And so what got lost in the dust is in fact making sure that persons with disabilities have the same sort of parity as everybody else included in equity issues and equality issues. And so it's a great shame to me that we have this unfortunate diversity, but it doesn't mean that good things don't happen from an advocacy point of view. Luis, tell us a story about successful advocacy in Brazil. I've always been very taken with your stories of the marches that you and your friends could amass at relatively short notice. Tell us about the successful advocacy in your view. What has changed as a result?
Okay, I think, Jeremy, when talking about Brazil, when our greatest achieve, it was like around 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that was like a legislation that obliged big companies to hire persons with disability. So we have a code, and this really started to change. And just to have an data, in Brazil, we have probably less than 2% of persons with disability part of the workforce. And so even with this legislation, even if we have a strong legislation about that, we still don't they are not like 23% of the population that we have with some kind of disability, and 2% or 3% of the workforce. But this law was really important. So I could say that this was like a milestone, an important milestone, that things starting to happen and persons is starting to be more visible at the society, because they're starting to work, they start to access money, and they start to being like respected as a consumer. Not all the time, but this is something that it is important. And
I love that. Thank you. Now carry on.
Oh, and also I think the ratification of the UN Convention was something really important here in Brazil, because after the UN Convention, we create what could be our ADA legislation, because in Brazil we call like LBI, that is Brazilian Law of Inclusion, trying to say something about that. And talking especially, Jeremy, about the march, and I know you really like the march, because it's something that we realize when we are younger. And this march was leading by persons with disability. I was one of the enthusiastic and helped them support. We started to say that our main theme was we have like something right, that we are at streets because the sidewalk is not accessible. And we started to do that like 10, 15 years ago in the main avenue in Brazil, the center of the financial, of the bank that we call Avenida Paulista, is one of the most important avenues in Brazil. And we were saying that we are at streets because the sidewalks, they are not accessible. And this was something important, and it was part of the movement in Brazil. It's not the only responsible for sure, but it was something important that we are trying to give visibility for persons with disability and trying to bring them their voice, because that's true. And each year we elect some effect phrases or something that we wanted to discuss. So one year was accessibility at the sidewalks, another one was education, another one was cultural, and things going. We did this here in Brazil in Rio de Janeiro, our main famous city, at Copacabana Beach. And in this time we have almost 8,000 persons at street. We bring some artists, some famous artists, some of them with disability and other just like singers. And what we're trying to do is, okay, we want to protest, because even that it was a protest. But we want to do this with good vibe, with good energy, with music. So we bring some singers, and they did like a shows. We bring persons with colors, because we say we are in Brazil. So if we're not going to use our language, we are not going to use what things is really important for our culture, we are not going to reach the society. And this is something important, because this was like Facebook, Instagram, and other networks, you know. And right now here, we believe that this movement is happening at the YouTube with some influencers in Facebook, and we are really fighting persons with disability. They are fighting against ableism, you know. So I think this, ableism, yeah, I think so. This is something that could be this seed, you know, that we put in the young guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Luis. You know, clearly we could stick with your example all day, because it's very rich. And I can't help thinking that Brazil, being a Latin country, and you know, you love your Mardi Gras. So the idea of a colorful march, including singers and artists, etc., there's an element of enjoyment, and I think with enjoyment there's achievement. I think other countries might take a leaf out of your book. Jeremy Warriner, any thoughts from you about achievements in your 16 years of having a disability, a significant disability, as a bilateral amputee and a burn victim, a burn survivor rather? Can you think of anything spectacular that you think could be attributed to advocacy that has happened in the States?
Well, yeah, and I want to jump on a couple things that you both said. One thing, Jeremy, you mentioned earlier was that we're not that culturally connected at an international level, and that is something that I think that's part of why we're doing this today, is because of this realization that if you look at people with disabilities not as each different disability, but as a whole culture, we make up the largest minority in the world. And I think that that is something that we are now at a point where technology is allowing us to connect and to make that level of advocacy step up. Within the last 16 years, my own experience, I mean, it really is about, at that self level, one of the very first things I encountered trying to be able to access my church was that was, even though the accessible parking spaces per the ADA were, you know, we had the right amount of them and they were as close to the church as they could be, there was still an uphill walk to get to the main entrance of the church from any of the parking spaces, or you had to deal with steps or ramp. But there was an entrance right by the accessible spots. It just wasn't accessible. There was even an elevator right on the other side of that door, but that door was not accessible. And, you know, that took, I was not the first person in a wheelchair at that church. That took me going to all the different committees at the church to talk about why that needed to happen. And actually, and even as a result of me sitting in the wheelchair in the aisle and sadly falling asleep, and I would tell the minister it was because of the medicine, but yeah, it was probably the sermon. But the what I found was actually within a short time, people within my community, because they were seeing me try to engage, started to push for things as well. So making cuts in the pews so that my wheelchair could fit in instead of having to sit right out there in the middle of the aisle in front of everybody.
Now there's a very important term there that we need to adopt, I think, more, is allyship. Is to become an ally. So there's a wonderful term in DEI language is allyship. So do we see enough allyship? Are there, Nilesh Singh, is there enough allied behavior? Do you get enough cooperation and advocacy from non-disabled people in India who fight a cause as well?
Not really. We tried to kind of, get in touch with architects and, some other groups. But one trend that I've been, noticing from past few years is that students, they are coming forward and looking at disability in a completely different way. They have been kind of, engaging themselves in matters of disability. So many universities and, colleges actually kind of, are looking at disability now. Disability studies is becoming quite popular in, many of the institutions. So that is kind of, really changing the narrative as far as India is concerned. It's still very early days. We may not find any, major changes, but but that process has begun. And I mean, it's the best thing to get young minds involved. I mean, they are the future leaders, they are the future people. So I think, that is something that, me and my group are investing in. I mean, trying to kind of go to colleges, talking about them, disability, and it's working out. But the real professionals, I mean, sometimes they can be a real pain in the, where, trying to convince them. But it's through advocacy, through use of, law, litigation, we have been managing to kind of get them to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I'm mindful of time. This has been such a rich conversation that I'm running short on the time because we're due to end in about 40 minutes. And I want to include questions, obviously. I'm sure there are many people who have questions. So Jacqueline and Jackie, I might ask you to be brief in terms of success. Jackie and Jeru from Kenya, I know you've had a very interesting journey with your son. And can you say that you've seen improvement? Can you see advancement, improvement in your time associated with disability?
Yes. What happened is that my son was severe and profoundly deaf on both ears, meaning he could never hear anything apart from loud blasts. And the audiologist told me in that case that his chances of ever going to talk were null. So we used the hearing aids, which could not help him. So we moved to the advanced surgery now, the cochlear implant, where he was implanted, and he started hearing. Now he hears everything. We did unilateral. We have not done the other one yet. So I'm still thinking about it. And in terms of speech, yes, he communicates. He is in school now. He goes to school. He's in grade 4. So what I normally advocate for is early intervention, because as a parent, there's a window period that crosses once they reach 5 years. So the earlier you intervene for them, the better, so that they may have the assistive devices. Then you will do the speech therapy and place them in the right schools. School placement is the best thing that can never happen to such a kid, where other kids like him, they feel at home. And the parental guidance and support from the family, as well as the caregivers, and even the school and the society as well. Remember, people are still stigmatized about this. So we thank God for this father to have come. I keep on looking at him and wondering if I really never intervened for him. Right now, he'd still be signing, which is very hard even for us to learn the sign language as a family. So I used to ask myself, how was he going to be integrated into the society, even with the sign language, So
Thank you.
I thank God for this path.
Now, I'm sorry to rush you, but there's one thing I wanted to bring up. Ken, our producer, doesn't mind a bit of controversy, so here goes. What is sad to me is that a device such as a cochlear, and it's not just a device, it's an operation, it's an incredibly invasive issue, a medical procedure to get a cochlear implant. It's extraordinarily expensive. It's hard to do, but in my experience of the deaf people I know who have had one, have had extraordinary results. And yet, sadly, there seems to be a resistance from quite a lot of profoundly deaf people, and that's deaf with a capital D. And I always find that very sad. It's one thing having your own opinion and choosing not to, but reverse advocacy applies there very often. I know in our country we have a problem where many of the profoundly deaf, in fact, actively work against cochlear implants. And it's so sad to me that we can actually move backwards as well. And we have to be very mindful of that. Now, several things that have been mentioned, I wanted to bring up a couple of things in the interest of time. And I'm going to be allowing about 20 minutes for questions just now, but not right now. Several people have brought up the issue of consumer. And at some point, I need to bring in the whole Rotary conversation as well. But what is interesting is how rarely, and it depends on your country as well, but how rarely persons with disabilities are in fact regarded as consumers as opposed to recipients of charity. Now, a little history lesson here, I think, for those of you who might not know, and I suspect many people in the room know this backwards. So apologies to those of you who do know this, but the fact is that we are not yet finished with the old-fashioned paradigm of the way that society looks at disability. Disability studies, people tend to go into far more detail than this, so apologies to them for being simplistic here. But just in a very simple way, we came out of a paradigm which we loosely call the medical model. And when I say came out, we are in the sense that we're all adults here. Only the very young, in their sort of 20s and below, would appreciate that there is in fact a new and will follow more assiduously a newer paradigm towards disability. So the medical model essentially said that people with disabilities don't really belong in society because, after all, they can't do things. So there was no association of barriers being in the way. Then, literally 50 years ago, more or less, that paradigm began to shift towards what we loosely call the social model. Once again, apologies to disability studies who like to really embellish here. But the social model essentially identified for the first time that it's the barriers that are in fact preventing us as persons with disabilities from accessing mainstream society. And so now this is the problem, in my view, that we are struggling. There's a word in English called slough. It's a silly word, spelled even sillier, but essentially it's the description of what happens when a snake sheds its skin. It's called sloughing. So we're having difficulties sloughing off the old paradigm around disability, especially older people, which is why there's so much resistance. And so you can identify this in a Rotary context. Now, Rotary is the world's largest NGO, 1.4 million people. And there's a lot of activity at the moment around diversity, equity, and inclusion. But there is absolutely no doubt that the poor cousin of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is disability, is underrepresented in Rotary. And I won't get into trouble for saying that because it's a categorical fact. As I said earlier in the beginning of this webinar, I am the only blind person, guide dog using blind person in Rotary in my district, and we're the biggest district. We're one of the biggest districts in the world because we encompass half of Angola, the whole of Namibia, and a big portion of South Africa. And so what is that? What is that? And why, or in my view, what it is that disability is still largely focused on, or rather the view of disability is still very colored by the idea of charity, doing it for them, as opposed to viewing persons with disabilities as a consumer, as a member, as somebody who is equal to. And so I'd love some views quickly from our panelists about what do you think an entity like Rotary could do for disability? I'm well known for saying this, that I believe, I'll just give you my point right away to save time. I believe that Rotary, quite literally, like they did with polio, quite literally could change the face of disability from an inclusion point of view. What are your thoughts, Luis? Any thoughts on Rotary and disability? Quickly.
Okay, try to be quickly. I think that is really important movement because Rotary in the end represents the society, you know, and you need to be more open in all society. And at the same time, I think we are talking about some age issues as the same, because we know that sometimes the rate of Rotary population, they are sometimes elderly population.
Older, yeah.
And then I think that's why sometimes we struggle to change this mindset. And I think it's really important you bring this discussion about the social model, because like we know, Jeremy, it's a process. We co-live with all this kind of situation. We still live with some this idea of donation, of needs, of charity, you know, and at the same time, probably in some places, these are really important. These still are changing some lives, you know, but this is not the only way we need to do. So we need to be really care about that and understand what is the community needs. And like a global organization like Rotary, we need to really understand about that. So probably in some countries, in some way, you need some kind of charity, but it's not for everybody. So I think the greatest thing is what the UN Convention brings is nothing about us without us. So each Rotary club needs to talk with persons with disabilities of their own community and understand what is their needs to bring them to the clubs and their needs in their whole life, you know, and with this situation, support them. And for me, sometimes it's really bad when we spend money, we spend resources, and we don't achieve what we need to. So I think this is the most important thing. Talk with persons with disability, bring them, is where everybody could learn about it.
That's terrific. That's terrific. Yes. I mean, I did a similar thing in my club. I mean, not only was I the first blind person in our club, but I introduced a quadriplegic friend of mine who happens to be the head of the local quadriplegic association. So a perfectly gainfully employed professional man. And it was a wonderful experience for the club to be able to, for the first time, engage with not just, you know, their new friend who is blind, and they've got to think things differently. Now their new friend who's a quadriplegic, and they've got to start thinking about access. And so that's really what I think should happen. Nilesh, what is your thoughts about the potential for an organization like Rotary?
Members of Rotary are, I mean, very influential people and sort of creme de la creme of that particular community. So, I mean, industrialists, I mean, businessmen and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I feel that Rotary should kind of, initiate a dialogue with them, create awareness program, and then when they go back to whatever they are doing, perhaps they could kind of, look into disability. So that is kind of an awareness building and, I mean, the partnership with disability that they could initiate. And also there is a lot of work on climate change that has been done. And unfortunately, I mean, disabled people are left out. So if Rotary wants to take up certain topic like climate change, they could kind of see to it that people with disabilities are also included in it and, advocate for that.
Thank you.
These are the things.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm in the interest of time, you understand, I do need to move a little bit. Jacqueline Wilson, you have a very interesting Rotary club that you, I think you started, didn't you, with doctors outside of Egypt?
Yeah. I think that Rotary did a good job. Here we have 3,000 persons or adults in Rotary clubs. We have 125 Rotary clubs here in Egypt. So if they are integrated together, they can do a fascinating job here. I think that the main job of the Rotary should concentrate on the training of teachers, training of caregivers, supporting them, education, classes to include the people with disability with normal children in schools, job fairs to try to find jobs and to increase employment of the disabled persons here in Egypt, medical convoys to help disabled persons and to do awareness and to know their needs, to know how to treat with these disabled persons. And I have a suggestion regarding Rotary clubs here in Egypt. I want to include one disabled person in each club, just one. We have about 30 to 35, and some clubs have 70 members. If we are intending to include one disabled person in each club, we can hear their voice. They will be they can represent their thoughts and express their needs, and so we can work on a practical level.
Thank you. And I think I'll get to you now, Jackie and Jero from Kenya, but let me just quickly say this, that by doing that, by including a person with a disability, will give you a different insight into possibly some of the things that you do. In your I hate the word charity, but I've got no choice here really, but in the work, the charitable work that you do, if you incorporate somebody, and this is what Luis was saying, of course, which is the credo of persons with disabilities around the world, is nothing for us without us. Jackie and Jero in Kenya, you're a upcoming president of a Rotary Club yourself, coming next year, like me. What are your thoughts about Rotary and disability potential?
Yes. So in Kenya, we have that ongoing already in our district. There's a department that we call Sunshine Larry that deals with persons with disabilities. Mostly we focus on children living with different disabilities in schools. So we actually organize one day per year where we entertain them and we assist them with the assistive devices. So I think that is a step towards the right direction. We are also looking into partnering with the National Council of Persons Living with Disabilities in Kenya. So that way we'll be able to do the more mapping in the marginalized areas, because they have already done that survey, and will be of much help and impact together.
Thank you, Jackie and Jero from Kenya. And I think this is so correct. And it's not about being prescriptive. No one's trying to say what you should do. But what we are saying, let me tell you a little story that I encountered some while ago. I do a lot of speaking at Rotary clubs around the world. And so a gentleman one day was telling us, and a similar thing happened actually 2 weeks ago as well, but a gentleman said to me how proud he was of his Rotary club because they had more or less adopted a wheelchair basketball team. And they were very pleased that, they donated chairs, they had kit, they found them a hall to practice in, they got them into a competition. And so they were terribly proud of their wheelchair basketball team. And I said to him, how many of those wheelchair basketball players are employed? And he didn't know. I said, how many of them are students? Possibly tertiary, possibly, good tertiary. And he didn't know. How many of them, I said, are interactors? Interactors, for those of you who aren't in Rotary, is our youth arm, if you like. Incredibly dynamic, wonderful feeding scheme in the sense for feeding, future Rotarians. Great way to experience Rotary in its enormousness. Anyway, I asked this question to him. How many of them are Rotaractors? And the answer was telling. He didn't know. He didn't know. And a similar thing happened recently when I was I was actually at a conference, and somebody approached me and asked me, was telling me that they're very proud because in their club had donated thousands and thousands of wheelchairs. And it's very difficult to criticize that sort of initiative because who can complain with thousands of wheelchairs coming in? The problem with that is you're not paying attention to the bums that are going in those seats. You're not engaging with the issue itself. What do you know about the actual individual's issue? What sort of a wheelchair does he need? Is it going to be suitable? Is it in fact safe? Are they at school? Are they at university? Are they employed? But if you're just getting off on sending thousands of wheelchairs out to people, that's not engagement and that's not inclusion. Before we open up for questions, I just wanted to reiterate something. So in the DEI acronym, so it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in my view, diversity obviously is very important. Equity is extraordinarily important as well. But the only way that we will ever progress in the world in terms of disability rights is if we learn to include persons with disabilities as a consumer, as a member of society that can engage with every level, whether it's your church or your shop, or your school or your university, or your Rotary club or your Rotary district. Inclusion is the real magic letter in DEI. And so I want to thank my panelists. Now, we're not over, because
Hey,
I
you're
suspect there
joking.
are some questions. Unless somebody, was that you, Jeremy? Would you like to say
Yes.
something?
Yeah, you jumped me. I didn't get to give my
You
concept on
didn't.
what Rotary.
Well, that's what happens when you share my name, I'm afraid.
I know, and that's all right. So, but and I'll
You're
be
right,
brief
I
on that. I do want to say there's so much to unpack, and I really hope we get to do that in the question answer period. But from what Rotary can do, Rotary has clubs in communities all across the world. The biggest impact they can make as they are looking at any project that they are considering doing within their community, they have to ask the question, is this accessible? And if it's not accessible, don't do it. You need to go back to whoever asked for that proposal and say, you need to make this accessible, because Rotary can go a long way in changing communities simply by looking at every project and asking that question.
And one thing that we could start with, in fact, is the digital footprint of Rotary, which is enormous. I mean, it's a massive, a very dense website with an extraordinary amount of resources in it. But sadly, it still has quite a lot of access problems from people with visual disabilities and people who are older, because it's so dense. And so that's, in a sense, what you're referring to, is, you know, that's one thing. I mean, we, in our country, for instance, there's quite a lot of activity around ECD, which is, early childhood development, and centers for early childhood development, so that they can be better prepared when they go into school. And the question is, how many of our ECD centers are in fact accessible to children with disabilities? So that's an example of what Jeremy is referring to. Before we open it up, and I'm going to ask Ken to help me here, I want to say one last thing about Jeremy, my name brother on this panel. Is Jeremy and I moderate a podcast. For those of you who haven't found our podcast yet, it's called World Disability Matters. And the two of us interview either each other or special guests, and not necessarily with a Rotary context, but up to now it has been largely Rotary. But it's all about World Disability Matters issue around the entire disability inclusion narrative. So please pop on to the World Disability Matters and see what we've spoken about. I think there are about 5 or 6 episodes that are up already, and there's a couple in the wings. So thank you, everybody. My panel, you were stunning. You were brilliant. I hope that our audience appreciated your collective wisdom and diverse opinions. And Ken, I don't know how we're going to do this, but can we open up for questions, perhaps on chat? You're going to need to help me there.
People can, there are some comments on chat, which we can get to, but people can raise their hands with questions. And Ali has a question, or his hands up for a comment. Go ahead, Ali.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to thank everyone on this call. It has been very illuminating for us. Thanks, Dr. Jacqueline, for introducing us. I'm a member and president of the Rotary Club of New Alamein, that's in the northwest of Egypt, and I've got 5 of our club members with us here. This is of special interest to us, the reason we're joining. I mean, Jeremy Opperman, you gave us some good insight on Namibia, South Africa, apartheid, and where disability stands. And let me tell you a very quick story from 1939, when Italian dictator Benito Mussolini stood on the eastern gates of Egypt, dreaming of a new Roman Empire, of which he would be the new Caesar, only to be repelled back by British and Commonwealth forces, and then asked for help from his friend Adolf Hitler, who sent, more German forces. War raged on for 4 years, leaving behind over 600,000 casualties and 20 million miles landmines in the western desert, a total area of about 200,000 kilometers. In US terms, that's around the size of anywhere from the Dakotas to Wisconsin to Oklahoma to Florida, 65,000 miles squared roughly. These mines are continuously leading to accidents, people losing their lives or becoming amputees or blind or deaf or any other sort of disability. And they are scattered over that very big area, which is very, very, very sparsely populated. There has been focus from the National Council of Disability in Egypt, many NGOs and many UN agencies, and there have been some vocational projects, some artificial limb projects, but I think we can definitely tap into your expertise and network to get some capabilities, some resources, some education, how we can best handle and support that diverse community. They're also a very insular community that is very shy to stand out or raise hands if they're still there and say, we need help. So one of the challenges we have, advocacy, is actually reaching into the community and finding out who needs help. Thank you, and sorry for the elongated speech.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Ali,
Ali.
for
That's brilliant.
contribution.
Thank you. That was
yeah.
very illuminating, and you're absolutely right. You know, it's a particular theme of mine. If I can just indulge my moderator a privilege here, just a little bit. What worries me desperately, and we see this in wars, we see this in shootings, whether they're in America or Denmark or New Zealand, is we paid far too much attention. I don't mean to be disrespectful of the dead, but we pay far too much attention to the dead as opposed to the survivors. So think of any incident recently in the last week, which includes obviously a shooting on the 4th of July in America. They pay far more attention to the 6 people who died as opposed to the 30 people who were injured. With a high velocity bullet, the chances are that you're going to be in a lot of trouble for a long time with a very strong probability of a disability. But because our media fixates on body bags and the dead, we actually forget, and we don't pay nearly enough attention to those. And of course, the Ukrainian war is a great example of that. You know, we talk about the death toll. We never talk about those who survived this with a lasting injury. And the landmine story, of course, we have exactly the same thing in both Angola and Mozambique here. And so Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, everywhere where, you know, in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Ali. I was very pleased that you did that. Moving on, who's another question?
Jeremy, Mona has a question here.
Thank you.
Mona, you're muted. You're muted, Mona.
Mona, before you ask that real quick, I wanted to comment on, Ali, what you were saying. So, and also what Jeremy was saying there as well. Sadly, I knew people that were at the shooting. They are okay, but their son has autism, and he is also okay and followed directions beautifully. But all 3 of them have psychological trauma that they're going to have to deal with as a result of that. And so what you were sharing with that community was basically saying that there's a community of people where disabilities are being regularly created. I would, from the amputee side of it, I would strongly recommend trying to find prosthetists who are able to do mission trips and who are willing to come there and work with people on limbs, and PTs who are willing to come there and help as well. But also I strongly would advocate for any psychological, anybody who's surviving that kind of trauma, that they get some psychological support for that as well.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. All right, we had a question from somebody.
Al had a question. I'm not sure. Oh, Mona had the question. Yes.
I have a small statement, and I hope it's okay to bring it. The first statement that I make is I ask myself every day, have I improved the disability issues around the world? I ask that question. And my biggest challenge, we brought that up earlier, what were your challenges? One of the biggest challenges I have is helping my own polio survivors to understand their needs and to bring their needs to the forefront of other polio people. By being a Canadian and having so much access given to me, I was part of the airline discussion back in the 90s. The airlines in Canada asked the population what were their needs. They did it through surveys, meetings, online meetings at the time in the 90s, and rechecking to make sure that things were accessible. This is the way we need to change the world. If Canadians who have a high level of disability awareness can bring that to the world, I am doing that part. I am part of the newest Accessibility Services Canada, and I'm part of that committee on the emergency access. So what happens when there's an emergency within a building? These are the issues that need to be dealt with. We're dealing with this on a province-wide written document, and we're trying to make it North America wide. We want to make it equal for all people to be able to get into a church and get out of a church, to get into a school and get out of a school. Disability has been an issue for over 40 years. And when I read Judy Heuman's book about how she had to fight to have a document signed after it was agreed to have disability, it was only then activated after you had the Disability Acts right. 40 years later, we are still fighting, and the rest of the world is fighting with us. In Canada, we need to fight even more. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona, very much.
Mona, real quick, I got to say, disability has been an issue since the beginning of time. And that is the realization that we have to make, is that it's highly possible that first wheel was made to create a wheelchair to get somebody out of the cave.
All right, Jeremy, yes. We're going to stay in Canada, and we're going to go to Al at this point.
Welcome, Al.
Yeah, thanks. I won't be long. I'll just say that I deal with a lot of families and persons with disabilities that require 24/7 care. They're quite disabled, and it puts a different twist on things. I would only say that most of the families that are involved with supporting loved ones have a difficult time learning how to advocate. And so we set up a small website that I put online there called voicesandchoices.org to share information, which can be extremely powerful when trying to find services and supports and advocate for somebody. So that includes just letters or, things that have been sent or summarized that one family has found success with, sharing with the others. So I just wanted to not forget those people that can't speak for themselves and are in care. That's it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Al. And now we'll go over to the United Kingdom and Gordon.
Good afternoon. I've been disabled since very early childhood, paralyzed below the shoulders. And so, access and advocacy have been important to me throughout my life. I'm now nearly 70. In England, or the United Kingdom, we have an Equalities Act which replaced the original Disability Discrimination Act. And these have been in force now for decades, some of them. But we still cannot get a lot of the bodies who are responsible to do what's required by law. Trains were supposed to be fully accessible long before today, but many in the north of England are still not accessible. Lots of buses are not accessible, and so it goes on. And most particularly, I'm arguing here for houses. New houses are supposed to be accessible, at least to get into the ground floor, the main reception room, the kitchen and a toilet, so you can visit your friends. But when I reminded the mayor of Bristol of this, his answer was, well, we're making 10% of the homes accessible. Fine, what about the other 90%?
Yeah.
Why can't I go and visit somebody? So, I mean, our mayor is in fact a colored gentleman, black man, very good, very nice person. But I said, if you banned black people from 90% of the new houses, how long do you think you'd still be mayor?
Yeah.
So, Jordan, a couple of things. One, the concept of aging in place and simply getting people to understand that disabilities are going to probably affect them at some point if they have not already. And if they don't affect them, they're going to affect a loved one. So making it a personal connection is one of the most important things. The other thing, implementation is huge, and it really does take the community getting together. I mean, we have to go back to 1973 for the Rehab Act. That one line, the last line of that was the first piece of legislation that said that any organization receiving federal funds in the United States had to be accessible to people with disabilities. That, though, took another 3 years for any implementation to happen. And it actually took the disability community taking over a federal building in California for over a month. When the power was shut off and the communication was shut off, people who were deaf went to the windows and signed to other people who were deaf outside in the community to let them know what they needed. And that was not just the deaf community. They were speaking up for everybody with every disability within that building, including people that were paralyzed. That's what it took to get the very first piece of legislation to actually move forward here.
Yeah, and I'm sure everybody finds exactly the same around the world. That it's all very well putting in legislation, but the need is to actually get that enforced and for people to understand. Because so often I sit on many advisory bodies for local and national government, and you go into a meeting and they just cannot understand why you're complaining you can't get into it somewhere or you can't join in something. It's sort of, well, you know, there are other people to do that for you. No, I want to do it myself. Thank you very much.
Exactly. Thank you. All right, you two.
We have one more,
running out of time.
One more question from David. He's in the United States.
Yeah, hi everybody. One thing that came to mind is that in trying to reach the community, I find that the community in general, unless their house is on fire, they don't appreciate the fire department. And the same thing is for disabilities, that until they're disabled, they don't appreciate our situation. And that's one of the issues that we address in a number of African countries, where we are building disabled, accessible pit toilets. So with Rotary being very involved with educating young people, if there's no toilet that works for them, then that's certainly a problem. But I posted my email in the chat, and if any of you are interested in helping us to build more disabled toilets, I'd be more than happy to share that information with you as we go forward. So earlier we were talking about advocacy, and for me, advocacy and action are twins. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you. It's interesting that, you know, I've always thought the difference between activism and advocacy is that no one pays an activist, but it's a very necessary thing. And it's, you know, if you notice that in the invitation Ken put out, we had a wonderful quote from Greta Thunberg about hope, and hope is never passive. You know, hope is action, and hope is from the people, always from the people. And I think it's very important that, because I heard somebody making a chat earlier where they said there needs to be far greater awareness, not just of able-bodied people, but with people with disabilities too. And this is so true. There is an enormous body of persons with disabilities who either don't know their rights or are or because there might not be any, right? There are some countries in the world you really don't want to have a certain type of disability, like you certainly don't want to be an albino in Tanzania, for instance. But they either don't know their rights or they are frightened. And this is what I wanted to have one last statement from my point of view, is advocacy is vital for organizations to practice. What I've found in my country, sadly, very often, is that they don't, and these are organizations meant for and of persons with disabilities, and they don't, in fact, practice advocacy nearly enough. And the reason for that is that they're frightened. They're frightened that they're going to offend somebody, possibly a donor, a funder. And they believe that sticking your neck out, particularly if you criticize the government, is in some way going to get you into trouble. And that's absolutely not true. One of the most outspoken people in our country, and he's an absolute hero from my point of view, from a very large, not very large, from a very significant organization, was incredibly aggressive, assertive, outspoken, and in your face. And his organization wasn't large in terms of numbers, but they punched way above their weight simply because he was not frightened to advocate. And so something we never touched on, sadly, for time reasons, but advocacy does take courage. And it's not just the individual with a disability. It's also the organizations that supposedly represent them. But it's also the alliedship of the families, of the friends. And something that Jeremy Warner was dying to say, and he didn't actually get it across, but I think he wanted to, was that not only are people with disabilities the largest minority in the world, with over 1 billion people, 1.3 billion people with disabilities in the world, but those who are affected by people with disabilities, in other words, families and friends, they make that amount go way up to the point where approximately 30% of people are in some way affected by people with disabilities. That mother with a child needing to go to a special school, she is just as affected. That husband whose wife has polio or post-polio is just as affected. And so we must remember that the consumer mindedness of disability inclusion is way bigger. And it's time that we grew up and applied far more assertiveness and confidence in this area. And that's the last word from me, Jeremy Warner. Knowing you also want a last word.
I think that was great. I want everybody to know that the idea behind this was for this conversation to be a starting point. What we are looking at doing is more topic focused workshops as we move forward. So please, however you heard about this, please reach out to the person you heard about it from if you have a topic that you would like us to cover.
And it's exactly 5:32, and we did say we were going to have a hard closure, and after 90 minutes. And so I want to say thank you absolutely from the bottom of my heart for everybody that attended this, both my panelists and the audience that attended and engaged with us. Thank you very much. This will not be the last one.
Hope is telling the truth. Hope is taking action. And hope always comes from the people.